The idea that it is not until late evening of the last day of the year of the cosmic calendar before the first emergence of primates able to use tools in a slightly more sophisticated way than Jane Goodall's chimpanzees raises an extremely interesting question. What took so long? How likely is it? Might it be that this is an extraordinarily unlikely event? That had things gone slightly differently, intelligence of this sort would never have developed on the Earth? This is an important question for those of us concerned about the prospects for extraterrestrial intelligence. And therefore, it has prompted me to try to see what at least I can understand about human evolution. And so let me now say a little bit about the origin of life, and then some more about the events in this last day of the cosmic calendar, and then go on to the question of extraterrestrial intelligence. All the organisms on the Earth are the same organism. There are some superficial differences, which many people have noticed, say between humans and oak trees, but in the deepest sense, there are no important differences. All of the organisms on the Earth use nucleic acids as the repository of genetic information, as the self-replicating system, which is essential for the propagation of the species. All organisms on Earth use proteins as the enzymatic catalysts to get the work done in the cell, and all the organisms on the Earth even use the same code book to translate nucleic acid information into protein information. The oak tree can read your book, so to say. And you could read the oak tree's book, although neither of you, of course, is highly motivated to manufacture the other, and you don't have the wherewithal. Nevertheless, the genetic code is, as the biochemists say with an interesting exaggeration, universal. By that they mean everybody they know uses the same genetic code. Now, this astonishing uniformity could have two sources. One is that there's only one way to make life anywhere in the universe, and that's nucleic acids and proteins and the particular genetic code we happen to have here. That is not impossible, but I think many chemists would bet on the opposite. The alternative is that we're all the same because we're all related, that we're all evolved from a single instance of the origin of life some 4,000 million years ago, and that's why we all resemble each other as closely as we do. Now, that's an important point to bear in mind, because if that is true, it means that at the fundamental biochemical level, much less things like organ systems and writing and social organization, beings elsewhere are likely to be very different from us. The question of the origin of life is surely not the same, it's not identical, with the question of the origin of nucleic acids and proteins, but the two questions are very closely connected. So in experiments, like the one I'm showing here from our laboratory at Cornell, in which you simulate or duplicate the primitive environment of the Earth, a mixture of hydrogen-rich gases that have high cosmic abundance, nothing special about the Earth in this particular kind of simulation, what one finds is that by supplying energy to such a mixture of gases here from an ultraviolet source, that you produce enormous quantities of organic molecules, including amino acids, the building blocks of proteins, and the nucleotide bases and sugars, which are the building blocks of the nucleic acids, suggesting that we are made of common stuff, that life on Earth has by and large used the junk the organic debris which was littering the surface of the Earth, and not extraordinarily rare or exotic materials, which raises other interesting questions. One could easily imagine a universe in which what you need to make life is not what is abundant. We apparently do not inhabit such a universe. We inhabit a universe in which what is necessary to make life is made all the time, easily, from the most abundant stuff around, which of course enhances one's expectation about life elsewhere. Now, the next slide is a brief backwards look into the history of the Earth, and we're looking at very small things. These are photomicrographs, and each of these spherical objects is about 10 microns, 10 millionths of a centimeter in diameter. And you see that things very much the same go back to some 3 billion years ago. Well, these guys, these recent guys, 45 million years ago, back here, we would recognize nothing at all because everybody is too small to see. In any case, these guys are bacteria and blue-green algae, the sorts of organisms which we know to be the simplest sorts, in fact, the kinds that don't have nuclei, and that this simple, humble form of life arose early and has been with us for a long time since. Meanwhile, all around it, lots of other organisms developing. Now, an important question for any organism is how much information does it need in order to do what it has to do? I mean, for example, the Viking spacecraft to Mars, which is sort of naturally in my thinking these days, is a semi-intelligent machine. It has, on occasion, to figure things out itself or do things without assistance from the Earth. To do that, it has a computer, and that computer has a certain number of instructions. In fact, it has a vocabulary of some 18,000 words. And within the limits of that information, it knows to do various things. If it is required to do a set of things which the description of which requires more than 18,000 words, it simply can't do it. Likewise, a grasshopper required to build a pyramid, despite the best intentions in the world, would be unable to do it. It does not have the information, or you might say intellectual wherewithal, to do it. Now, an organism like a grasshopper has almost all of its information pre-coded, much as the Viking spacecraft has. That is, it is information largely, not exclusively, but largely contained in its genetic material, the sort of thing that we in earlier years would call instinctual, pre-coded, hard-wired information. But even grasshoppers can learn by experience. Even paramecia can learn by experience. So it's not that all the information is pre-wired. There is some plasticity, even in very simple organisms, some ability to learn from the environment. Therefore, there are two kinds of information which organisms before human beings have: pre-wired and learnt, or as we might say, genes and brains. Human beings have added a third kind of information, extrasomatic, that is outside the body. Libraries, for example, reading material, microfilm, records, inscriptions on buildings. Anything which is not instinctual or remembered, but you have to go look at something to know what it's about, is extrasomatic. But there is, with, I think, trivial exceptions, no other organism on Earth which has a significant body of extrasomatic information. So it is of some interest to try to quantify the amount of genetic information in a given organism, the amount of extragenetic information in the brains of the organism, and the amount of extrasomatic information in the libraries. To do this, we have to use a unit of information called a bit, a binary digit, which is, in simplest form, the yes-no answer to a single question. So a good way of thinking about about a bit is to think of the popular, or at least it used to be popular game, 20 questions, in which it is imagined that anything you're thinking about can be described by yes-no answers to 20 questions. But you can see that if you divide the universe equally with each question, then the universe is divided into 2 parts with the first question, into 4 parts with the second question, and by the time you get to the 20th question, into 2 to the 20th power parts. And it turns out there are a lot more parts in the universe than 2 to the 20th. And the reason that 20 questions works is because we have unspoken assumptions that there are a whole bunch of things that are not to be used in 20 questions, like the 137 millionth atom from the right on this rug right here. Nobody would ever get that one in 20 questions. That's thought to be too specific. Now, it is possible to make a rough estimate of the amount of information in both genes and brains of various organisms. And for the brains, we have to make the assumption that what counts is the number of neural connections, so-called synapses, in the brain. We have 2 curves, genes here, brains here. And what we have plotted here is the number of bits of information versus the time of origin of the organism now bearing that amount of information. So, for example, a bacterium arose billions of years ago, you remember the previous slide, but contains only, in its genetic material, only a few 100,000 bits of information. Human beings arose a few million years ago and contain in our genes, some 10 billion bits of information, which can be calculated from the number of nucleotide pairs in the genetic material in the 23 chromosome haploid set that human beings have. Now, suppose it takes more than about 10 billion bits of information for a human being to do what a human being has to do. In that case, a human being is in trouble unless he, she, it has an additional source of information. And that additional source is provided in our brains. And at least for most people, what we do is more determined by brains than genes, although in lots of cases it's a dead heat. And so a rough estimate of the number of bits of information in the brains of a single human being is about 10 to the 13th, about 10 trillion bits, some 1,000 times more than what's contained in the genetic material. This is very rough and ready, but I think to order of magnitude, these numbers are correct, which means that there was a moment in the history of life on this planet when the first organism emerged that had slightly more information in its brains than its genes. That was an epochal moment symbolically in the history of the planet, although I'm sure that organism didn't think much about it. It being some early reptile in the Carboniferous period, I'm sure it didn't give a moment's thought to this significant fact. Now, I would put forward the hypothesis that a critical reason for the evolution of brains, and I'll say something more about it, there's been a spectacular growth in brains in this little period of time right here, is due to the fact that the genetic information content was saturated, and also that the rate of change of the information in the genetic material is very slow, whereas the rate of change of the information that organisms have to have faced with changing environments has to be adjustable on shorter timescales. Well, brains solve both of those problems. And this factor of 1,000 is the difference between a reptile the size of a small cat and us. And there are those who say it's not all that much difference, but it's a factor of 1,000. The extrasomatic information is way off over here somewhere, something like 10 to the 18th bits of information, and that's some 5 orders of magnitude more beyond the amount in our genetic material. In our brains. Now, that provides some perspective on why so fast. Why only lately? Because it's only lately, that is only in this last 100 million year period, that genes were saturated in information content. Now, this suggests that we should pay close attention to the evolution of brains in this region. And I'd like now to present two engaging observations, quite different, made independently using different material, which lead, I think, to very similar sorts of conclusions. The next slide, please, is a plot of the mass of the body of a given organism versus the mass of its brain. And it's clear that the bigger organism in general ought to have a bigger brain. For a given body mass, birds, and especially mammals, are significantly heavier in the head than are fish and reptiles of the same mass. And that separation is so systematic and striking as to suggest that there is a real functional difference. And then when we look, next slide please, more closely at which points belong to which organisms, we find that moles and eels and rats and vampire bats, fish, crows, ostriches. But then when we start getting to the top part of the diagram, we find wolves, lions, elephant, dolphin, whales, and in here, the primates. And chimps and gorillas right here, and in fact, they all fall in this region, all the great apes. And here are the gracile Australopithecines, probably close collateral relative. Here's Homo habilis, who Louis Leakey made famous. And here's us. Now, if you look at who's up here, you find that it's guys like people, dolphins, elephants, and whales, who we have quite independent anecdotal information suggesting are smarter than the other guys. There is, I maintain, probably not perfect one-to-one correlation, but a very significant statistical correlation saying that the organisms that have the largest brain mass for their body mass are smarter. The dinosaurs over here are, compared to mammals like elephants and whales, spectacularly stupid. I mean, differentially speaking, they are the most stupid organisms that are ever around because they're, enormous weights, 80 tons, and then the brain, weighs 30 grams, and which is about the brain of a rabbit. And there's a lot more bulk to move around than a rabbit has. And you immediately have the sense that those guys might have been pretty terrifying killing machines or tree-eating machines, but they may have been quite vulnerable to guys a lot smarter than them. So a little hint of the primeval warfare between mammals and reptiles, which is so perfectly preserved in our myths and children's unprovoked fears of monsters, one wonders if there isn't some reflection of that in here. Now, what it says is that the step from reptile to mammal, because after all, us mammals are descended from the reptiles, was a very major step in terms of the evolution of the brain, and that the evolution of the primates, and particularly the family of man, from the other mammals was maybe not as spectacular a step, but still a very major step. By the way, notice how close on this diagram, say, a chimp is to a gracile Australopithecine. Remember that the gracile Australopithecines their remains are associated with the use of tools. And then when we recall Jane Goodall's findings that chimps use tools, and then this remarkable set of recent findings that chimps are perfectly able to communicate in languages designed for their particular anatomies. Now, This argument from the ratio of brain mass to body mass is quite separate from the next argument which I want to present to you. Next slide, please, which is due, at least in contemporary guise, largely to Paul MacLean of the Laboratory for Brain Evolution of the National Institutes of Health and a Leakey Foundation speaker. What I have here is a very rough sketch of the brains of 5 representative organisms: fish, amphibian, reptile, bird, and mammal. And what has happened is that if we separate the forebrain from the midbrain, we see that there has been a steady relative progression of the mass of the forebrain compared to the rest of the brain. And this has, of course, its greatest flowering in us, where we are some 95% by mass forebrain. The next slide is a schematic diagram due to MacLean of the human brain. Now, MacLean argues that there are anatomically distinct portions of the forebrain in, let's say, human beings, but in all the mammals. And that the deeper parts of the brain are clearly connectable to our ancestors. MacLean believes that this innermost, deepest part of the forebrain is a brain which we share in many important details with alligators. A part of the brain which has not evolved very much from the time of our reptilian forebears. That surrounding this is the limbic system, which we share in many significant respects with the other mammals, and that surmounting all of this, accreted on top of it, so to say, is the neocortex, the 2 cerebral hemispheres, which primates, and particularly human beings, have as their proud anatomical indication of our state of advance. MacLean finds that if you take out in monkeys, let's say, pieces or cut pieces of the reptilian complex, you remove the ability to do certain kinds of behavior. Hierarchical social behavior, aggressive behavior, ritual behavior, things which reptiles do. He argues that the limbic system involves an entire new way of looking at the world, involving, among other things, strong emotions. And that the neocortex, of course, is strongly responsible for our analytic abilities, although he does not argue for a powerful, complete separation of function, and believes that some evolution in the reptilian complex and the limbic system has occurred in human beings, and that we're not identical down there with the dinosaurs, but close enough for us to have to pay attention. And this idea immediately opens up all sorts of marvelous speculations, which can clearly be overdone, about which kinds of human behavior are due to the reptilian complex. And you just did a reptilian thing. But the idea that there are parts of the brain which go back very far, which were an essential part of our instinctual apparatus, matches very nicely the separation in the brain mass to body mass ratio diagram that I showed before. So 2 quite different approaches in comparative anatomy, which give very similar conclusions. As I said, the first use of tools, as far as we know, in a characteristically human aspect, is several millions of years ago in East Africa by gracile Australopithecines and Homo habilis. And we've seen a major development in the use of tools since then. And I think it is clear that the widespread use of tools has strong selective advantage that you have a better chance of getting food or mate or beating off the opposition if you have tools than if you don't, everything else being equal. And I'm sure that most of you, having heard other lectures in this or similar series, know the now conventional ideas about how upright posture, freeing of the hands, tool use, all evolved together, along with the slow emergence of gestural and then spoken language. But the development of the neocortex is astonishingly rapid in that same period, and the American anatomist C. Judson Herrick called it the most spectacular anatomical development in the history of the vertebrates. I would like now to ask the following question. This sequence of events, this broad spectacle of the evolution of organisms on the Earth, reaching its latest interesting point in us, but hopefully having some long and further interesting period in the future, how typical is that of the evolution of planets? Is that a common event, or is it an extraordinarily unlikely event? So if we're going to have the next slide, I'd like to rapidly go through some relevant points of information. This is the psychological projective test, which astronomers call the Horsehead Nebula, for obvious reasons. The Milky Way galaxy is replete with dark clouds of this sort, gas and dust obscuring the light of more distant stars. And a very interesting finding by microwave line searches in modern radio astronomy is the finding that these kinds of clouds are full of organic molecules in very large quantities. And the organic molecules run up to 5, 6, 7 large heavy atoms. And to give you an idea of how much, there's a cloud in Sagittarius called B2, I think, which contains ethanol, the stuff that some humans like to drink. The amount of ethyl alcohol in that cloud is sufficient to satisfy the drinking requirements of all planets in the Milky Way galaxy, assuming every star has 10 planets, assuming that every planet has a population equal to the Earth, and assuming that every organism has the same alcohol consumption as Americans do. And for a period of 10 billion years. Well, there is some trouble in acquiring and distilling, but it's there to be used. Now, how is it that organic molecules, many of much greater biological interest than ethanol, including nitriles, which then blocks of amino acids, how is it that they're sitting out there in a hostile, radiation-rich, extremely cold environment? It's another indication that making organic molecules is tremendously easy. Next slide. There are also a lot of places. This is a slide showing an extremely small fraction of the stars in the Milky Way galaxy. If you were to back off from the solar system by 30 light years, which is 1/1000th of the distance from the solar system to the center of the galaxy, and looked back with the naked eye, you would see something like this. And what is of interest is that from that tiny distance, the sun would be as bright as the dimmest star that can be made out in this picture. The sun would be, say, that guy right there. And were you to move a dozen or 2 light years beyond, the sun would be totally invisible, even to the keenest unaided human eye. So there is nothing extraordinarily remarkable about the sun. You can hardly see it from almost everywhere in the galaxy. Imagine a tiny little sphere around the sun, and only guys in that sphere can see the sun, without some very elaborate technical equipment. Well, that gives us an interesting perspective on the significance of the sun and the planets, which, of course, you would not at all be able to see at such a distance or even at the distance of 1 light year, in the galactic scale. In the Milky Way galaxy, which is only one of hundreds of billions of other galaxies, there are hundreds of billions of stars. The total number of stars in the accessible universe is something like a 1 followed by 22 zeros. There's an awful lot of places for an awful lot of evolutionary experiments to have taken place. And the problem is to try to figure out which is the nearest place that an interesting evolutionary experiment has occurred, which has carried that life form up to a stage where it is capable of interstellar communication, because we have now reached the point where we ourselves are capable of doing just that. The contents of messages from other societies with independent, all those things I said, biologies and chemistries and societies and sciences, would be, I think, an epical moment in human history, the clear culmination of all of that development of tool using and high intelligence and exploratory instincts, which have been responsible for our success as a species.